The ballroom of Lord and Lady Hargrave blazed with the light of 300 candles. Each flame doubled in the tall mirrors that lined the silk-hung walls. Miss Eleanor Whitmore stood near the refreshment table, her gown the muted blue of a winter sky. A deliberate choice, for anything brighter would have been a lie her circumstances could not support. She was 25 and had stopped counting seasons 2 years ago, when her father's gambling debts stripped the family name of its last gilding. Now she existed in the margins of the ton, a useful companion to her widowed aunt, invisible enough to observe and intelligent enough to understand precisely what she observed. The Duke of Ashcombe entered late, as he always did. Alexander Ashcombe carried his title like a weapon sheathed in velvet, his dark hair brushed back from a brow that seemed carved for command. He did not scan the room rearranged itself around him. Men straightened, mothers angled daughters, whispers rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. Eleanor did not angle. She reached for a glass of lemonade instead, her fingers brushing the stem an instant before a footman turned abruptly. The glass tipped. Lemonade splashed across the Duke's sleeve as he passed. The pause that followed was the length of a held breath. The Duke looked down at his ruined cuff, then up at the woman responsible. His expression held no anger, only a kind of weary amusement, the look of a man who had suffered a great many clumsy attempts to catch his attention. "Provincial manners," he murmured, his voice pitched to carry to the eager ears pressing close, so rarely improve with proximity to their betters. A titter ran through the circle of bystanders. Lady Hargrave fluttered. The Duke's mouth curved in a slight, dismissive smile, and he moved on without waiting for a response. Eleanor felt the heat of humiliation try to reach her cheeks and refused to grant it permission. She set down the half-empty glass with deliberate calm, smoothed her gloves, and turned toward her aunt, who stood frozen in dismay across the room. Every eye upon her prickled like pins. She did not flee, she walked. Her spine remained straight, her chin level, her pace unhurried. At the threshold of the ballroom she paused and turned. The Duke had reached a group of admirers, but his gaze inexplicably had tracked her retreat. Eleanor dropped into a curtsy, not the rushed bob of embarrassment, but a curtsy of such exquisite, unhurried grace that it became something else entirely. A statement, a punctuation mark, a door closing with infinite composure. She rose, met his eyes across the sea of candlelight, and left him standing in the silence her departure had somehow created. The night air of the Hargraves' portico struck her cheeks like a cool palm. Her aunt came hurrying after, full of anxious flutterings, but Eleanor merely took her arm and guided her toward their hired carriage. Behind them in the ballroom, the Duke of Ashcombe discovered that the conversation around him had become inexplicably dull. He touched his damp sleeve and frowned, not at the stain, but at the memory of that curtsy, which had somehow made him feel smaller than any insult she might have flung back. He did not understand the feeling. He suspected, with a prick of irritation, that he wanted to. 3 weeks of rain-swept country lanes brought Eleanor to Ashcombe Park, the Duke's principal seat, in a carriage that smelled of damp wool and her aunt's lavender sachets. The invitation had been addressed to her aunt, Lady Pemberton, a distant connection of the Duke's late mother. Eleanor's inclusion was an afterthought, or so the neat script implied. She knew better. She had seen the Duke's hand in it, and her acceptance was not surrender but reconnaissance. She would not be hunted again. The house party assembled 18 guests in chambers of oak and ancestral portraits. Eleanor navigated the first evening's dinner with polished reserve, seated far from the head of the table. The Duke's gaze found her 3 times. She returned it not once. On the second afternoon, while walking the long gallery to escape the chatter of the drawing room, Eleanor heard voices through a partially open door. Her name, spoken in Lady Cecilia Broughton's honeyed sneer, stopped her mid-stride. The Whitmore girl, reduced to a companion's position, and yet she carries herself as if she were the prize of the season. The father lost everything, did you know? Everything. Gambling, cards, horses. The mother died of the shame, I expect. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the gallery rail. She had heard worse. She had built her composure from years of worse. Another voice cut through, lower, harder, unmistakably the Duke. "You will not speak of Miss Whitmore in my house as if her circumstances were a moral failing. Her father's sins are not hers to wear. I will not hear it again." The silence that followed was the kind that rearranged furniture. Lady Cecilia's stammered apologies trailed off into retreating footsteps. Eleanor remained frozen, the polished wood cool beneath her palm. That evening the Duke sought her out in the garden. She had walked to the reflecting pool, where the water lay still as black glass, the moon a shivered coin upon its surface. She heard his boots on the gravel and did not turn. "Miss Whitmore," he stopped an arm's length away. "I owe you more than an apology for the Hargrave ball. I was cruel without cause. I have been cruel without cause more often than I care to admit. It is a habit this title encourages, and I am trying to break it." She let the silence stretch until he shifted his weight. Then she turned. "You spoke well for me today, Your Grace. I heard you. But words are not counters to be traded, cruelty here, kindness there, until the balance is settled. A wound does not heal because the hand that struck ceases to strike. You understand?" He did not look away. "I am beginning to." "Good evening, Your Grace." She gathered her shawl and walked past him, the gravel whispering beneath her slippers. Her heart beat hard and fast, but her gait remained unhurried, her head unbowed. He stood by the black pool until the chill seeped through his coat. The garden offered no comfort, only the echo of her words and the memory of the moon outlining her steady shoulders as she had walked away, leaving him no ground to stand on but the hard earth of his own making. London in early autumn wore a cloak of amber light and brittle leaves. Eleanor returned with her aunt to the narrow townhouse on Curzon Street, expecting the quiet rhythm of a companion's duties. Instead, the Duke began to appear, not ostentatiously, but with a persistence that was all the more remarkable for its restraint. A volume of poetry arrived, not signed but in a hand she recognized. An invitation to a musicale came through Lady Pemberton, with the Duke's compliments. At the circulating library, she turned a corner and found him examining a shelf of agricultural treatises, as if a duke might browse such things like any gentleman farmer. He did not press. He merely existed in her orbit and waited. Lord Philip Stanton presented himself as a bracing contrast. He was golden-haired, quick to smile, generous with compliments that landed like warm rain. Eleanor found his company easy, though a needle of caution pricked at the back of her mind, something about the way his charm never flickered, a performance without an intermission. He paid her marked attention, and the ton noticed. Within a fortnight, the betting book at White's carried wagers on whether the Duke would be outflanked. The musicale at Lady Trowbridge was the moment Lord Philip chose to act. After the soprano's final tremulous note, as guests milled toward the supper-room, he took Eleanor's hand in full view of 20 gossips and dropped to one knee. "Miss Whitmore, I can offer you a life free of want. I admire your strength, your grace under fire. I ask you to be my wife." The proposal had the polish of something rehearsed. Eleanor's mind raced. Before she could draw breath to frame a gentle refusal, a familiar voice cut across the crowd. "Forgive me." The Duke stepped forward, his expression taut. "Miss Whitmore, I must speak with you, privately. This is not a decision to be made under a gallery stare." Eleanor's gratitude curdled into fury. He was intervening not because she could not choose, but because he assumed she might choose wrongly, choose Philip, choose a man not himself. She withdrew her hand from Lord Philip's grasp and rose. "Your Grace, Lord Stanton." Her voice carried a chill that quieted the room. "I am not a prize to be claimed, nor a matter to be settled between gentlemen. I have no answer for either of you tonight. Good evening." She left the Trowbridge house with her aunt, her pulse a drumbeat of anger and something harder to name. Lord Philip's easy smile had vanished. The Duke stood rooted, his jaw tight. That night a letter arrived. It bore the Ashcombe seal. Inside, the Duke's hand had abandoned all formality. He did not declare love or demand an audience. He wrote of the night at Hargrave House, of his own long habit of using words as armor, of the way her curtsy had cracked something open in him that he had not known was sealed. He asked for nothing except the chance to be heard when she was ready on her terms. Alina read the letter 3 times. She folded it with care and placed it not on the pile for the fire, but in the drawer of the writing desk beside her mother's miniature. The clock on the mantel ticked toward dawn before she slept. A week of silence passed before Alina sent word, through her aunt, that she would walk in Hyde Park on Thursday at the unfashionable hour of 10. The Duke arrived alone, without a groom, his overcoat plain and his hat unadorned. Lady Pemberton followed at a discreet distance, close enough to chaperone, far enough to grant the illusion of privacy. They walked along the Serpentine, the water dull pewter under a sky scrubbed of cloud. The Duke spoke first. He told her of a boy raised in a house where love was a currency, and the Duke's late father had traded only in criticism. He told her of learning to mock before he could be mocked, of building a reputation for coldness because warmth had always been a prelude to disappointment. He did not offer these facts as excuses. He laid them down like stones across a stream, a path she might choose to follow or ignore. Alina listened with the stillness that was her particular gift. When he fell silent, she said, "You are not the only person to have suffered, Your Grace. Suffering is not a credential. What you do with it, that is the measure." "I am attempting to do better, Alina." The sound of her name, unadorned by title, hung in the air between them. She met his eyes and saw something that had been absent before. Not desire, not conquest, but a raw and uncertain hope. It was the most dangerous thing he could have offered her. That fragile thread stretched between them, taut and unspoken, until the ball at Countess Wrexham's 3 nights later. The evening began with promise. The Duke danced with Alina twice, and the Tun murmured its astonishment. Then, during the supper interval, a folded paper passed from hand to hand like a contagion. An anonymous letter. It accused a certain lady of faded gentility, of deliberately engineering the spill at Hargrave House to ensnare the Duke, of playing a long game of fortune-hunting. The language was viciously precise. Every detail pointed to Alina. She read it with fingers that did not tremble, though the floor seemed to tilt beneath her. Conversations around her grew hushed, then cut. The Countess looked stricken. Lady Cecilia Broughton smirked behind her fan. The Duke's voice, when it came, was not raised. He simply began to speak, and the room was forced to listen because a Duke speaking in a tone of iron compels attention. "This letter is a falsehood. It was not Miss Whitmore who sought my attention. I pursued her. I pursued her against her wishes, against her dignity, and she has rebuffed me more times than I care to count. She has never asked me for anything, not a title, not a fortune, not even an apology, though I owed her one. Any man or woman who repeats the content of this letter repeats a lie, and will answer to me." The silence that followed was absolute. Alina stared at him, her heart a wild, trapped thing. He had just laid his reputation at her feet publicly, irrevocably. Later in the carriage, she turned to her aunt. "I cannot stay in London. I will return to Whitmore End. I need to breathe air that is not thick with scrutiny." Her aunt protested, but Alina's resolve was set. She sent no farewell note. She simply packed a trunk and boarded the post-chaise at dawn. She was stepping into the carriage when the Duke's curricle rounded the corner at a speed that scattered street vendors. He leaped down, his composure fractured for the first time she had ever witnessed. His voice cracked on her name. "Alina, please, do not leave like this. I will do anything. I will change anything. Only do not go." She turned on the step. The morning light was pale, merciless. She saw the desperation in his face, the pride stripped away. She felt the pull of it, the dangerous temptation to soften. But she had spent years building herself into a woman who could survive anything. She would not unbuild herself for a man, not even this one. She gave him no words. She gave him a curtsy, slow, precise, perfect, every line of her body speaking of finality. It was the same curtsy she had given at Hargrave House, but this one meant goodbye in a language too deep for language. She climbed into the carriage, the door closed, the driver snapped the reins, through the window. She saw the Duke standing alone on the pavement, his hands at his sides, his face a ruin of loss. She looked forward and did not look back. Whitmore End was a modest estate in the rolling country of Somerset, its fields modest, its manor house comfortable but worn at the edges like a beloved book. Alina arrived with the autumn leaves and threw herself into the small domestic tasks she had missed, overseeing the still-room, visiting tenants, walking the lanes she had known as a child. The peace was not immediate. It had to be earned day by day, hour by hour, until the memory of London's cruelty began to recede like a tide. On the fourth morning of her exile, she looked up from pruning the rose garden and saw a rider coming up the lane. The figure was unmistakable, even at a distance. The Duke of Ashcombe on a hired horse, not a glossy thoroughbred, his coat plain and travel-stained. He did not demand an audience. He asked her butler, in a voice she heard through the open window, if he might speak to Miss Whitmore when she was at liberty. The butler, flustered, conveyed the request. Alina received him in the garden, her hands still in her gardening gloves. "I have taken a room at the inn in the village," he said, as if this were a perfectly ordinary thing for a duke to do. "I do not ask you to return to London. I do not ask you to forgive me. I ask only to be near you, in whatever way you will permit." She looked at him, the shadows beneath his eyes, the uncharacteristic uncertainty in his posture, and felt something shift, a crack in the wall she had built. But she only nodded once and returned to her pruning. He came every day after that. He read aloud to her in the parlor while she mended. He walked with her to the village to deliver remedies to a sick tenant. He asked questions about the estate, the crops, the names of her dogs. He did not speak of London. He did not speak of love. He simply remained, a steady presence, as if he had all the time in the world and she was the only thing worth spending it on. The evening that broke the last of her resistance was unremarkable in every external way. She had walked to the village alone to post a letter. On the green, a child's kite had tangled in the low branches of an oak, and the boy, a farmer's son, stood beneath it, weeping. The Duke, returning from some errand of his own, set down his parcel and climbed the tree without a thought for his coat. He freed the kite, climbed down, and knelt in the dirt to show the boy how to mend the broken string. His hands, which had known only polished leather and crystal glasses, moved with careful patience through the rough twine. Alina watched from the lane. The sight undid her. Not the grand gesture, but the simple one. The dirt on his breeches, the smudge on his cheek, the way he laughed when the boy's face lit up. He noticed her then and rose. He walked to her, and without preamble he lowered himself to one knee on the dusty road, heedless of the gathering village eyes. "Alina, I have no fine words left. I have no pride left. I have only this: I love you. Not the idea of you, not the conquest of you, but you, your steadiness, your sharp mind, your unyielding heart. I will live wherever you wish. I will be whatever you need. I only ask you to be my wife, not as a duke asks, but as a man asks a woman who has taught him how to be human." She stood above him, the autumn wind pulling at her hair, and tears slipped down her cheeks. She did not speak. Not yet. But she reached down and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, and the hope that flared in his eyes was nearly unbearable. She did not give him an answer that evening. She needed time, she said, time to trust what she was seeing, time to believe that transformation could be permanent. He accepted her condition without a flicker of impatience and returned to the inn, leaving her to the long, quiet hours of self-examination. Days passed. The village hummed with the news that a duke was kneeling in roads and mending kites, but the talk was gentle, more wonder than malice. Then her aunt arrived from London, breathless with news. The duke, it seemed, had been quietly engaged in a campaign of repair. Debts owed by tenants on his estates had been forgiven. Old quarrels with neighboring landowners had been resolved with handwritten letters of apology. Several sharp-tongued ladies of the ton had received visits in which the duke had calmly, implacably, insisted they cease their slander of Miss Whitmore. He had not threatened. He had simply made it clear that his future and his favor lay elsewhere. Alina listened to her aunt's recitation with a strange pressure in her chest. The evidence was overwhelming. The man had remade himself, not for show, but in the quiet places where no one was watching. That night she sat at the writing desk and composed a letter in her clear, unhurried hand. "Meet me at the Garden Folly tomorrow at 4 o'clock. I will have an answer." She arrived first, the Folly a small stone pavilion overgrown with climbing roses, the afternoon light slanting through the pillars. The Duke came promptly, his stride that of a man who did not know whether he walked toward absolution or the final blow. She stood before him straight and calm. "I love you, Alexander. I have loved you, I think, since the night you defended me in your gallery, though I fought it with every weapon I possessed. I will marry you, but I will not live in a house where my worth is measured by the ton's shifting scales. I want this field's quiet purpose. I want a marriage, not a performance." He took her hands. His grip was warm, steady, reverent. "Then you shall have it. We will make Ashcombe Park a home, not a stage. I will spend the rest of my life earning the trust you have given me today." She leaned into him, and their kiss was not a fire but a hearth, steady, warm, built for the long winter. The trouble arrived the next morning in a gleaming carriage bearing the Ashcombe crest. The Dowager Duchess, the Duke's mother, descended with the force of a storm front. She was a tall woman, iron-gray and iron-willed, and she did not waste time on pleasantries when she cornered Alina in the morning room. "Miss Whitmore, I will be direct. You are a sensible woman. You must see that this match will destroy my son. The ton will never accept you. He will be a laughingstock. I am prepared to offer you a settlement, a generous one, if you will release him and leave England for a time. The continent is lovely in autumn." Alina felt the old anger stir, but she met it with a clarity that surprised her. "Madam, your son is not a possession to be bargained for. I am not for sale. If you cannot accept his choice, that is a sorrow you must bear. I will not release him. I will stand beside him, and if the ton laughs, we will not hear it. We will be too busy living." The Duke appeared in the doorway. He had heard enough. He crossed to Alina's side and faced his mother. "You are welcome in our home, mother, when you can offer respect. Until then, you are not welcome. The choice is yours. It has always been yours." The Dowager stared. Her composure rattled for the first time in decades. She swept out without another word, but her departure felt less like victory and more like the end of an old, bitter chapter. The Duke turned to Alina and pressed his forehead to hers, breathing as if a weight had been lifted. They were married in the village church of Whitmore End on a morning so clear and cold that every sound carried: the bells, the birds, the rustle of the small congregation that had come to witness the improbable union of a duke and a companion. The ceremony was simple. No army of society guests, no 12-tiered cake, no orchestra. Only the vicar, her aunt weeping quietly in the front pew, the tenants and villagers filling the rest, and the light pouring through the plain glass windows like a benediction. Alina wore a gown of ivory wool, practical for the season, a spray of dried lavender tucked into her hair. The Duke wore his finest coat, but his eyes held none of the old arrogance. They held only her. As the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the church door creaked open. The Dowager Duchess entered, her face unreadable, and took a seat in the last row. She did not smile. She did not speak. She merely stayed, and that staying was, in its way, a capitulation, a seed of truce that might, with years and tending, grow into something gentler. At the wedding breakfast, spread across trestle tables in the manor's great hall, the Duke rose to speak. The room fell quiet, expecting the polished oratory of a man born to command. What they received was something else entirely. "I have spent most of my life believing that my title was my worth," he said, his voice carrying without effort. "I was wrong. I learned otherwise from a woman who never raised her voice, never begged, never lowered herself to meet my cruelty. She walked away. And in doing so, she taught me that strength is not in holding on, but in knowing when to let go of pride, of fear, of the man I used to be. Eleanor, you curtsied your way out of my life once, and I thought I had lost everything. That curtsy, that final, beautiful curtsy, was the turning point of my existence. Thank you for coming back. Eleanor looked at him across the table, her eyes bright, and the applause that erupted was not polite. It was warm, human, full of the joy that gathers around a hard-won happiness. Years flowed like a river after that. They divided their time between Ashcombe Park and Whitmore End, eventually settling into the country for good. The Duke became known as a fair and generous landlord, his tenants prosperous, his fields fruitful. Eleanor oversaw the still room and the schoolhouse, her days full of small, meaningful duties. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who grew up climbing the same oak trees their father had once regarded with ducal disdain. One afternoon in late summer, when the garden was thick with roses and the air hummed with bees, Eleanor paused on the terrace and looked down at the lawn below. Alexander, his hair touched now with silver, was on his hands and knees, a small boy on his back and a girl tugging at his sleeve, their laughter rising like a flock of startled birds. His coat was grass-stained, his cravat long abandoned. He looked nothing like the cold Duke of the Hargrave ball. He looked like a man who had been saved. Eleanor smiled, one hand resting on the stone balustrade. She thought of that curtsy, all those years ago, the way it had felt like an ending, a door closing on everything she might have wanted but would not beg for. She had walked away with nothing but her dignity, and that dignity had brought a duke to his knees and then to his feet, a better man. It had not been an ending. It had been the first note of a song she was still singing, a song whose melody was the laughter of her children and the quiet constancy of the man who had learned, too late and just in time, how to love.